Good afternoon and welcome to today's webcast, PowerShell Abuse, Good Tool Gone Bad. My name is Mark Britton from Carbon Black and I'll be your moderator for this session. Today we're going to discuss PowerShell and the increase we've seen in attacks utilizing native Windows tools. Please feel free to type any questions you may have in the chat window and we'll address them throughout today's webcast. Presenting today will be Keith McCammon from Red Canary and Jonathan Ross from Carbon Black. Keith and Jonathan, please say a few words to introduce yourselves. Keith, let's start with you.
Hi, good afternoon or good evening, and thank you all for joining us. My name is Keith McCammon. I'm the head of detection operations at Red Canary. We're a managed service provider. We focus on providing very high-end detection using Carbon Black's enterprise response platform as our primary data source. My responsibilities are for detection technology and roadmap, as well as our analysis team. So we'll be sharing a number of products of our work today. So again, thank you for joining us and looking forward to the talk. Jonathan.
Thank you, Keith. My name is Jonathan Ross. I'm a systems engineer with Carbon Black, working with customers in the northeast part of the United States. And recently I've been spending a lot of time using the products to combat people living off the land with PowerShell and other trusted tools that attackers like to abuse for us.
Great. Thank you very much. All right, so without further ado, we're going to dive in. So I'll go briefly over our agenda. Shouldn't be any surprises here, right? So this is what's on deck for today. Dig in a little using PowerShell and kind of come to the forefront of providing a couple of tricks and approaches for detecting malicious PowerShell in an enterprise environment. Lastly, John's going to cap that off with a really neat presentation of a tool they're going to be releasing soon, which shows how you can glue their two products together to do pretty tactical but effective response to not just not just to detect, but also to disrupt attacks that are using things like PowerShell and even other native tools. So to get the lay of the land a little bit here, the not too distant past, the majority of the threats that we saw were pretty static, right? So executable files, malicious documents, very heavy focus on just getting a PE on disk, gaining execution the old-fashioned way, and then proceeding on from there, right? We've been increasingly effective at countering that using application controls, Carbon Black's Protect product, Enterprise Protect product, and also just sound configuration control and a number of additional security products that are on the market. So a very natural evolution has occurred here. So what you're seeing threat actors start to focus on are the things that you can't just rip out, right? So native tools, PowerShell, WMI, HTA, things of that nature. And we've got one solution to that, which we'll share, which is going to be focused on Carbon Black suite of products, and some of the things that we're doing at Red Canary on the detection side, which incidentally can be implemented or applied in any number of ways, right? So we're going to try to keep this as technical as possible, as tool agnostic as possible, but also try to show you some real world examples of things that we've seen, things that you can do. So why PowerShell, right? This is not unique to PowerShell, but that's what we're focusing on today. This is one reboot of the living off the land concept, and we've seen this come and go in a number of ways. As we become more effective at mitigating PowerShell-based attacks, attackers are going to move on to something else. So, but at a high level, the reasons why living off the land are effective, at PowerShell in particular, you've got it's a thing that you can't rip out, right? I mentioned that previously. Most businesses, rely to some degree on PowerShell and tools like it. It's not a thing that you can just turn off. It's enabled by default. on all of the Microsoft platforms. And as we'll get into later, one of the most attractive things from an attacker standpoint is that it leaves very few forensic artifacts behind. So who's using PowerShell, right? The neat thing that that we've seen here is that it's what we're seeing today, and I've kind of like come to this this realization as we put this presentation together, that we're really seeing almost a renaissance in terms of PowerShell, right? There's this amazing nexus of information that's available, and to be clear, the information's been available, right? So you go back, several years, you've got a lot of researchers, in particular forensics folks, focusing on this. But what you're seeing now is that all that knowledge is really becoming mainstream, and you're starting to see tools to match it. So, whereas before it was a thing that was focused on, it was a relatively niche discipline, right? Now you're starting to see these really popular tools. You're starting to see some pretty well-known threat actors utilize PowerShell. And again, we've seen it before, but it's definitely on the uptick. You're starting to see some really high-profile malware families. And then, of course, you've got researchers who are putting out some really, really high-quality tools for both the red team and the blue team. So just to take a look really quick at some of the offensive capabilities that you get with PowerShell, and this is really scratching the surface, but it's all of the things that you need as an attacker, right? You've got reconnaissance. You've seen PowerShell implementations that mimic Mmap, or even include that for network mapping and reconnaissance. Obviously, execution, both local and remote. Code injection, credential stealing. Moving all the way to the right to data exfiltration, things like that. So to kind of set the stage, in terms of scope, right? So it's important whenever we're trying to, determine how we're going to respond to a threat, how much time we're going to, dedicate to researching, identification of new detection technologies and approaches. How big of a problem is this? So if we take a big step back, one of the really neat things that we get from Carbon Black Enterprise Response is, unlike a lot of security tools that just send you the bad things, right, or what they think is bad, we get everything, right? So we get raw endpoint telemetry, good, bad, and otherwise. It makes it's really dealing in observations, much more than it's dealing in alerts and things like that. And so we see about 0.3% of all processes across all of our customers. We've got a pretty sizable fleet of Carbon Black Enterprise Response servers. 0.3% of all processes that start are PowerShell. So really, really small percentage. But if you look at the other side of this, it's involved in 7% of all confirmed threats. So you could see a little spike there around the beginning of the year, but it's steadily on the uptick, right? So for something that represents such a small percentage of just raw endpoint activity to be responsible for what's inching up on 10% of all the confirmed threats that we see, that's something that we need to put a lot of time into. So what do these look like, right? We'll start by giving you an example. This is a detection we found. This is post-exploitation activity in a customer environment. So the attacker in this case had already gained a foothold, had obtained domain credentials, and it had at this point had moved from end user workstations where they began their attack all the way into the heart of the network. And so we'll just show you from top to bottom, what this detection timeline looked like from our standpoint, and then we're going to move into taking this apart. So we're going to start to dig in a little bit to the features of PowerShell. So don't worry too much about what's in the guts of all these commands. We're going to dig into that in a second. So just to set the stage, you have a couple of relevant processes here that started. You've got service host and WMI privacy. So the next thing that happens, and this is pretty typical sequence of events, particularly post-exploitation, is you've got your first instance of PowerShell that starts, right? So this is almost like their bootstrap. Makes an internal network connection to a staging server they have set up. Sets proxy credentials, and goes and fetches an executable script. So the next thing that happens is that that script is executed. You can see here that things get unpacked. The snip in the middle is a massive base64 encoded string that gets pulled in, decoded, and then decompressed, and eventually executed in the form of a process. Resulting that same PowerShell command we just saw initiates another internal network connection, and then we see here the payload at the end, right, or the objective. So an injection into LSASS, which is pretty typical if you're attempting to gain any type of credentials, escalate privileges. And then an interesting thing happened here, and that PowerShell process was used to inject into the CB's user space process itself. So that was pretty interesting because what they attempted to do was use Carbon Black, the Carbon Black process itself, assuming that it wasn't being watched, to achieve some additional lateral movement. Take a break there for a second. Mark, do we have any questions, or should I keep going?
We have one in here. It says, can you play back commands in PowerShell like you can in CMD with your product?
I'm sorry, playback commands with PowerShell in the same way
like
you can in CMD with your product?
Yep.
There's, if I understand, so I'm assuming the product they're asking about, CB, enterprise response. So you can't replay the commands directly there. So you do get the full, you get the command line, so you have all the information that you need to replay the command on a Windows system. But we don't have, there's no hypervisor, or there's no component of the product that allows you to do that natively now.
That's it so far.
Great. All right. So now we're going to get into some of the interesting bits. So we're going to start talking about some of the features of malicious or PowerShell in general that are often used by attackers. I've loosely mapped these to stages within the attack lifecycle. These features are certainly not restricted to being used at any particular stage. It's just a convenient way to bucket them. So the first thing we'll look at is execution, right? So that's usually step 0. You got to execute somehow. Either you're gaining initial execution to get your foothold, or you're persisting and you're executing repetitively. In the case here on the left, you can see this is task ing. So this is a case where an initial foothold already existed. Task ing job had been registered, and they're using that to continue executing additional commands. So the most important of all of these is execution policy at the top. So the way that PowerShell functions is that scripts, by default, scripts need to be signed in order to be executed. And so as an attacker, what you need to do is you need to bypass that somehow. And the easiest way to do that is by running PowerShell on the command line and just telling it set execution policy to bypass. Occasionally we'll see them use unrestricted, but bypass is by far the most common. Down at the bottom here too, just as another example, PowerShell being spawned by MSHTA, which is another form of nasty and another native tool that we see used on occasion. So next we move on and we dig into silence, right? So you gain execution. The thing that you don't want to happen as an attacker is for a big blue window to pop up. Even worse, you don't want a big blue window to pop up with a prompt and the user actually has to interact with it, answer it, close it in some way in order for your operation to complete. So the next feature of PowerShell you'll see used is this suite right here. Very commonly you'll see 2 or 3 of them together, and I think if you look across all the examples we've got today, you'll notice different variants of them. Very, very important to take note that every command in PowerShell, almost every command has an alias. PowerShell commands can also be given arbitrary aliases, so we've certainly seen cases where, post-exploitation, the attacker can, once they've gotten system-level access or elevated privileges once, they can set aliases for almost all these things, making it that much more difficult for you to go back and reconstruct what's happened. But at a high level, removing interactivity, making sure that there's no windows that show up, making sure that no logos appear on the screen and things of that nature. All right, so next, I mentioned early on that one of the critical features is that you're leaving very few forensic artifacts on the system, right? Years ago when it was very common for a PE to get dropped, you're touching the file system, you're touching the registry, you're doing all these things, and in many cases you end up doing, attackers end up doing many of those things, but they can push it farther to the right. So they've established their foothold, they've figured out what's on the system, they have the ability to disable security controls. They've got the ability to work around some of those constraints that they used to have, so that they don't have to blindly make changes to the system. So the easiest way to get around that is by using a feature of PowerShell called encoded command. And again, you've probably seen this in most of the examples I've shown you and in the wild in general. So what that is essentially a PowerShell command or an input to PowerShell that's base64 encoded. You'll also see some examples here in a few minutes where you can do multiple levels of obfuscation, but fundamentally it's taking either a command line, a sequence of command lines, a chunk of code, or an entire binary. You base64 encode that, and then you pass it to PowerShell in the command line. So, in the case of some of those tools you saw earlier, Empire, things like that, you could take the whole Mimikatz binary, you can base64 encode that, pass it to PowerShell in the command line. You never had to drop that on disk. Same is true of Nmap or almost any tool you can imagine. So you could see here a simple example. We again snipped this base64 encoded command here, but if you decode that, this is what you get. In this case, this is actually an instance of a piece of malware setting up DNS changer. So you could see the URL at the bottom is a pretty well-known piece of DNS changer C2.
Hey, Mark, this is John. You asked about tools we might be releasing around this. We did get published today to github.com/carbonblack, a tool that will look through your Carbon Black data and decode all of those commands for you and leave you nice little links back into the user interface to investigate.
That's awesome. So you can, it's base64 decoding, John, is that correct?
Yep, goes through, finds all the PowerShell invocations that have base64 in them, undoes it for you, prints out the clear text version of that, and gives you a link back into the system to research the specific process if you see something like some of the things you're showing on the screen here that you might not like.
Yeah, that's fantastic. That's actually, so that ties in nicely to what I'll show you here. So some of the things that that we've been working on doing, exact same, right? So base64 decode, you want to take that apart, you want to figure out the code behind the code, so to speak. If you've got the ability to do that, and then in particular, if you're using Carbon Black Enterprise Response or something like it as part of your infrastructure or as part of your platform, one of the neat things you can do is that once you've got that decoded, incidentally, you might decode it and find out that it's still gibberish, in which case you've got something right here, so you still need to take, there's another operation you have to complete, so decompression or something like that. But the really neat thing is that once you do that, whereas a lot of what we're going to show you is identifying malicious or suspicious PowerShell based on a lot of these features or combinations. One of the neat things you can do is that you can now almost write very simple IDS-like signatures, right? You can actually look for specific function calls, JavaScript, VB, PowerShell native, whatever it is that it deobfuscates to. So there's some really, really powerful detection you can do if you've got that deobfuscated or decoded and are able to pass that to another system. Very cool. All right, so lastly, data in, data out, right? So it's all well and good to go throw malware into a target environment and move around. There's always an objective, and that objective is always to get something out. Whether it's summary information or bulk data. And so the feature of PowerShell that you see used both up front and on the back end of intrusions are all these network functions, right? So a web client, very, very commonly used when you see exploit kit activity. seeing this gets used after initial execution to go out and gather later stage malware, other scripts, commands to run. Similarly, you've got HTTP and mail and things like that that can get used to either send data out or receive it. So you've got a lot of interesting stuff that happens there. Incidentally, the example on the bottom left was kind of neat. So this is something that one of our detector sets picked up in a customer environment. The neat thing about this is that it had all of the hallmarks of some pretty advanced post-exploitation. So, leveraging, some of the obviously invoke expression and stream reader, but then also encrypting some of the payload and doing what on its face at the bottom looks like lateral movement of some type, utilizing hidden shares either on the system itself or across systems in the LAN. This actually ended up being another security products installer. So we're starting to see that more and more. That these features of PowerShell can be used obviously for good or bad, and they're all intended for good in the start. It's an extremely powerful tool, and so now it's in some respects, it can make detection and analysis a little bit more difficult because you're going to start to see a lot of applications and a lot of administrative uses of PowerShell in some very, very interesting ways. All right, so now we've talked a lot about not a lot, not enough, but we've talked about the features of PowerShell in general. So now let's talk a little bit about how you can go about detecting it. So first things first, mind command lines. I think that's all. It should be apparent to everyone. But that's where all of your relevant information is, right? So yes, there could be scripts put on disk. It's the exception. And if it does happen, that's going to be later stage. But minding your PowerShell command lines is the first thing you want to do if you're interested in performing any type of detection. There's many permutations, obviously, of all these features we've seen. And we've already seen encoding, compression, crypto, all those things kind of get chained together in some really interesting ways, and can obviously expect that to get more complicated and even more interesting in months and years to come. Yeah.
Hey, Keith, we had a question come in. I think it pertains to the slide previous, so I just wanted to address it before we got too far.
Sure.
Says, how is this detected alerted in the first place? Is there an alert for all PowerShell commands set up?
So yes, I'm assuming that's referring to the product itself. So there are no alerts built in, or no queries or watch lists built in that attempt to find malicious PowerShell or PowerShell in general. So that's in terms of the CB Enterprise response side, and I think we're absolutely going to address what happens at the operating system right here, and then in the next 5 or 10 minutes, I think hopefully we'll come full circle and answer that question pretty directly. So on the operating system itself, there's a few things that happen. So these event IDs up here at the top, 400 and 403. These are your basic PowerShell session markers. So that means when a PowerShell a PowerShell session is instantiated and then eventually exits, you're going to see that in your event log. It's very important to note that that's not giving you the command line, right? As you can see at the bottom, command line logging was added into PowerShell in version 3. Unfortunately, 99% of systems that we see have PowerShell version 2 built in, and as is the case with Python, if you're using CentOS or RHEL, yes, you can rev to a later version. Almost no one does, just because it tends to break things. So, but again, at a basic level, 400 and 403 in your event logs are going to be your session markers. 7937 is actually going to show you executed scripts, commands, and commandlets. Again, this is not giving you the full command line, but it is going to tell you, all right, someone dropped a PS1 script to this path, it executed. It's also going to show you commands and commandlets, so you are going to see, if someone, someone dropped and ran, invoke Mimikatz, or if they, using AD modules, things like that that are native to PowerShell, that's going to get logged, but you've still got a pretty significant blind spot. And then again, PowerShell version 3+, you are getting some additional information sent to a number of different event log destinations. Obviously, then you've got to go and you've got to be collecting Windows event logs and combing through those. There's a note at the bottom here that everyone, it's definitely worth paying attention to. Excellent presentation at Black Hat 2 years ago related to forensics and PowerShell. And so in addition to these event IDs and some of this, the scanned information I have here, there's a whole bunch in there that's worth understanding. All right, so now we'll pivot a little bit and show you what detection looks like if you're using the enterprise response platform. So take some simple examples here, right? So the first one, looking for combinations of a few of these common features, so invoke expression and the web client module and using its download string function. Download files also used very, very commonly. And the second one down here, which is showing you a pretty straightforward sequence of events, right? Did a browser spawn PowerShell? And at the bottom, again, similarly simple. Did WinWord spawn PowerShell? And obviously, for the sake of brevity, I didn't include them all, but you can also include an array there that includes all the Office products, mail clients, things like that. This is just an expanded view of the little snip, or the thumbnail I had in the previous screen. So this is what you'll see in Carbon Black when you have an exploit kit land, right? So you've got your iExplore process over on the left. You've got your PowerShell process of interest that you detected here in the middle. You could see the command line build up. So you could see it pull, goes and pulls a second stage payload, drops that to disk, and executes it. As I mentioned earlier, it's not, most of the commodity malware is not attempting to stay perfectly silent forever. They're just using PowerShell to get over a bunch of initial hurdles, and they're doing it really successfully. Now we move a little bit later stage. So example of Mimikatz, right? So did PowerShell initiate a cross-process event with a target of LSAS? And Mimikatz is not the only tool that does this. There's lots of tools that do things like it. There are lots of tools that inject or initiate cross-process events into the LSAS target for good reason. If PowerShell is doing it, very unlikely that it's that it's something normal. So that's the type of thing you want to look out for. Worth mentioning here too that taking this approach, you can probably already see that you can start to build up a bunch of different arrays. I mentioned earlier having an array of browsers or an array of Office processes that you want to look for. Same thing here. You could for any one of these things, you could probably swap out PowerShell with command.exe, WScript, CScript, MSHTA, a bunch of things like that. A few more. So getting into a slightly lower fidelity, just looking for execution policy bypass and looking for encoded commands. Middle one here we use we see a lot when we find web server compromises. So primarily, this tends to be your third-party applications running an IIS web server. Process gets popped. First thing that they do is go where they know, right? The PowerShell's there. It's at a predictable location. It gives them a really easy ability to escape. And then down at the bottom is one that you'll see a lot of times when you're dealing with an interactive intrusion. So a threat actor as opposed to commodity malware. So yes, you can keep passing dash execution policy bypass in the command line to get your PowerShell to run forever, but it's noisy. So as an attacker, you want to continually reduce the number of things that you have to do that are going to raise eyebrows, right? And so one of them is trying to bypass execution policy overtly. So you just go in the registry, change your execution policy, set it to bypass by default, and now that's one less suspicious argument you have to pass to PowerShell as you continue to operate. So that concludes the features and the detection piece. So now we're going to talk a little bit about response. When you you look at living off the land, and you're talking about detection and disruption of attackers who are using native tools. It's challenging, right? You can't ban PowerShell enterprise-wide. You can't ban command.exe. You probably can't even ban things like HTA. To varying degrees, the enterprise and operators and admins rely on that. So what you've got is a pretty significant challenge, right? You can use these approaches we just showed you and some of these queries or these features to pick out suspicious or malicious processes, but then what do you do with that? So I'll turn it over to John now, who's going to go ahead and give you a presentation of a tool they're going to be releasing in the near future that shows how you can snap together the Carbon Black Enterprise Response and Enterprise Protect tools to do some really, really novel automated disruption. So John, over to you.
Thank you, sir. And Keith, can you see my screen now?
It's a great question. I can.
Excellent. Thank you, sir. What I want to do now is take everybody through a live demo where I use both Carbon Black products, both CB Enterprise Protection and CB Enterprise Response, to deal with one of these PowerShell attacks. I'm going to use the PowerSploit module that was mentioned on one of the slides, and we're going to use some invocations similar to what you've seen on some of the queries on the slides. When I launch this attack, I'm playing the role of the malicious insider, but everything I do here, you could stage up in a phishing email, you could send it through a web form that you had abused in some fashion, or in a compromised document. It doesn't really matter how that part gets started. I'll go ahead and launch this thing now. Oops, that's what I get for copying things and answering questions during the webinar. This command string's kind of long, so I keep a copy of it and just paste it in, because who wants to type all that out by hand at one time? The other machine I have running here is my attacker system, and that was kind enough to host the PowerSploit module for me, and then receive my connection from my compromised endpoint to start sending commands at it. The attack, if we don't do anything about it, will go through and recon the network to find out if there are other targets on the network it might want to attack later on. It will steal passwords, because we always like to get your passwords when we land on your systems. And eventually it's going to take every file off of this desktop. What's going on in the background, though, unbeknownst to the attackers, Carbon Black Enterprise Response is monitoring everything that's going on. And in CB Enterprise Response, we don't make any judgment about the data we collect. We just collect everything. And I have deployed code that watches for malicious PowerShell invocation and triggers a policy change on this host in Carbon Black Enterprise Protection. And if you noticed, my command prompt in my PowerShell went away. The change in policy actually hardens this host more. And now if I try to relaunch my attack, Carbon Black Enterprise Protection tells me I'm not allowed to use the command prompt anymore. And you know, I'm not going to launch PowerShell that way now, but PowerShell has a GUI, and I'm not going to get at PowerShell that way anymore either. Those tools have now been blocked from me. I'll give you a look at both the products here so you can see what exactly changed. This GUI is the Carbon Black Enterprise Response GUI. You can see the server and the workstation I have in my environment here. And I had the screen loaded in the background so that you could see the starting state for my policy. Our workstation that we just abused was in a policy called end users. And normally in this network, all of my systems are in a default deny posture. You see this high enforcement mode here. We only run software that we trust. We've got lots of ways to define that. But of course, PowerShell and the command prompt and the PowerShell GUI, these were all things we trusted initially in this initial state. To refresh the page now, we'll get to see the current state. And you can see where that automated response I had going in the background has changed the policy of my host to the penalty box. Now the penalty box probably sounds pretty bad, and for the attacker it was. Inside of the penalty box, we're still in a default deny posture. We're never going to run any software we don't trust. But we've also now taken additional steps to harden the system by denying access to all the system utilities that we see popular for living off the land techniques. I can give you a look at the events here so you can see exactly what happened. The first event I have down here was when I reset the demo for before the webinar started. And then here we go at 1:32 p.m. when I'm running my attack again. We received a signal to switch that policy. And one of the other nice features of my penalty box policy, if I find any of those system utilities running when a system is placed inside the penalty box, I go ahead and terminate them. So it was Carbon Black Enterprise Protection that went ahead and closed PowerShell and closed that command prompt in front of our eyes. And then you can see here, of course, when I try to relaunch and try to get back at those tools, they're denied to me now. One of the things that we find is important, especially when you want to get at attackers using these type of techniques, is we've got to do everything we can to disrupt the attacker. We want to make their work harder. We want to buy ourselves time. Every second counts during an attack. And anything we can do to frustrate the attacker, to disrupt their techniques or their plans, it's going to buy us more time to respond before they're able to inflict more impact upon us. Now, over in Carbon Black Enterprise Response, I have a watch list set up that is using one of the searches we saw in the slides earlier here. The system is always watching for this bad PowerShell technique. And you can see something that was probably 3 or 4 slides ago now implemented actually in the system. I didn't come up with this search myself. This actually came from a couple of customers who used the products to profile how PowerShell was being used in their environment, both legitimately and maliciously. And it's interesting, before I read the conversation with those gentlemen on our customer forum, I had thought an encoded command by itself would be pretty suspicious, but they actually both found legitimate uses for encoded commands in their environment. Were it my network, I would, from an IT hygiene perspective, love to ask my users to find another way to run those scripts as opposed to encoded commands. But they found legitimate uses, so that's fine for their network. They understand where the legitimate are. But that also means they now have a little more visibility and perspective to understand what illegitimate uses would be to maybe trigger a response like I did here. If we scroll down, we can see exactly the things the attacker achieved while they were active on the system. While we won't replay the command for you, we'll show you the whole command line here so you can see everything that happened. We can come down and call out things like the network connections that downloaded the module and open the command and control channel. We could run through and verify that the registry changes and the file changes weren't anything outside of the normal that we would see when PowerShell was invoked. I don't have any cross-process here, so it must not have made it to its password thievery, which is nice to know. I didn't lose my passwords. That's great. We can also take a look here down the line and see all the invocations of the recon commands that were successful. Now, we did lose some data here. The attacker knows a little bit about our network now. They've got some of our IP info. One of these nets may have given up some usernames. That's not great, but it's much better than having lost every file on the system or lost the password hashes. Or lost any other number of records that the person used the recon data to pivot around and attack further.
And John, if
the
I
other
could,
night,
oh, sorry, if I could jump in just for 1 second, I wanted to follow up one of the great points that you made about, with respect to encoded commands and just the fact that, PowerShell really does, or how it's used in every environment can be very different, right? And so if you think back to those slides that I showed earlier, every little one of those snippets, like those are all things that we've detected, right? And ended up passing on to customers using the data from Carbon Black. Not 100% of those end up being malicious, but they're all worth looking at. And so, just kind of want to drive home that point you made that, the most important thing is that whether you're using Carbon Black products, using something else, absolutely, like at all costs, start finding a way to capture this data, right? If you can't afford to buy anything, look strongly at going to one of the later versions of PowerShell, but get this level of visibility one way or the other. Eventually, you march through that to get detection, and then you can do things like this on the response side. So, thank you. Just wanted to jump in there.
No, absolutely. Those are great comments. The visibility is the first step, and it's so important. And that profiling, it's even beyond the visibility, but profiling and understanding what are the good business-based use cases for these tools and what do they look like. Because once we have that, we have the contrast to know what the malicious use cases look like, and that can support us then maybe implementing other tools to take an action against the system. And while certainly here, since I work for Carbon Black, I have access to both products. The automation then is easy for me to use Carbon Black Enterprise Response to feed, change, and CB Enterprise Protection. But with the open APIs we have out there on GitHub, you could use Carbon Black Enterprise Protection to receive signaling from something else, say maybe your event logs or your SIM that had received them. You could also use Carbon Black Enterprise Response to signal a different control to take action against this. It's important for us that not only do we make it easy for you to share this work out on GitHub and with our customers on our internal websites and unite that way, but we really think it's important that we start uniting our tools together, irrespective of whatever vendor they come from. We've got a lot of security tools out there. We've got a lot of information. It should start supporting some automated action for us, provided we have the visibility. And let us start getting ahead of these things and stopping these attacks in real time. One of the things I like to talk to people about when I was running security practices, my goals at the end of the day were really twofold. I wanted to reduce my risks. I don't like to be exploited. But I also wanted to reduce the impacts. And since I can't shut PowerShell down without an undue business impact, if I can have a way to recognize the malicious invocation as it occurs, cut it off and stop it before it can achieve many goals, deny that attacker time, I also deny the impact I suffer from that. Again, you know, I don't want people knowing my usernames, and I don't want people knowing my IP schemes, but I'm not going to lose sleep over that stuff, and nobody's going to sue me because I lost it. Nobody's going to fine me or charge me any penalties because I lost it. And with that, Keith, I think we've got time for a couple more questions if there are any, and I'll pass this back over to you for the last couple slides.
Excellent.
So Jonathan, are you able to see the questions pane on your toolbar?
I am, but I don't have questions inside of it.
Okay, there's quite a few that came through, so I think we should just address them at the end, and I can send them to you in chat.
Yep, I've got a couple of them here. So what I'll do is I'll go ahead and wrap up real quick. So really, to summarize in 2 minutes or less so that we can take some of these questions, because I've definitely got a couple here that I've already received and definitely want to answer. What do you do, right? So I think we've hit this pretty hard, but step 0 is visibility, right? Implement a process or some instrumentation and start collecting all the information you can about PowerShell activity. If all you can get today is, are those simple, PowerShell start and stop markers, that's not fantastic, but it's better than looking at nothing. And at a minimum, you can start to figure out, all right, well, should somebody have been using PowerShell over here or not? And then you can go dive in. Once you start collecting that, and ideally, once you start collecting all those command lines, the important information, prioritize your analysis based on feature to threat conversion, right? So, come up with as many of these queries, or profile as much of this information as you can. Start to figure out, which of those PowerShell arguments or features or combinations thereof are the ones that are, resulting in actual, realized threats inside your environment. And obviously the community is a great way to leverage that too, right? A lot of this information's out there, and start prioritizing your analysis accordingly. And then you start looking at your investment lifecycle. So visibility, analysis, detect, and response. Figure out where those gaps are, where you're falling short. Figure out, which tools and/or which services can help you do that most effectively. And with that, I think we're going to go ahead and take some questions. So,
Sounds good.
Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, they've been feeding me a couple of questions here. Let's see. When the systems get hardened, does Carbon Black catch changes of names and applications? And yes, it's tracking that. Carbon Black Enterprise Protection is tracking that all the time as part of its application control. You can't just change a name on it and think that's going to get you around the rule set. And Carbon Black Enterprise Response will notice those file modifications, record them, and highlight them to you if you need to. Let's see here.
Yeah, I've got one here. I'll take while you're finding another one, John. So
go ahead.
Had a question that came in a while ago, asking how Emmet 5.5 is going to change things, right? And so that's actually a really good question and a very important distinction to draw. Emmet is fantastic. Everyone should have that deployed. It's to the point where there are very few downsides. Like there are some competitive issues, but by and large, you're not going to get better exploit mitigation for your dollar, and it's free. So that said, there's a distinction there in that Emmet is Emmet's doing a very specific thing. It's detecting exploitation of a process, right? So it's got introspection into processes. It's looking for abuses of memory, things trying to read and write out of bounds, and then it's mitigating those things. And if it can't mitigate, it's those processes' fault and they go away. So the important thing to keep in mind there is that PowerShell isn't by definition doing anything illegal, so to speak, right? Emmet's looking at PowerShell to see if the PowerShell process itself is being abused, but Emmet's job is not to look at how PowerShell is being used and decide whether that's good or bad, if that makes sense. And I have one more that's kind of closely related, which I'll knock out. A question about wildcarding parts of a regmod path. So the question was, is there a good way to wildcard parts of a regmod path, or does it need to be exact? Does not need to be exact. If you look on Carbon Black's GitHub repo, they've got their really great, like 15, 20-page guide that explains their query syntax. But you can insert wildcards in there. There's performance penalties doing it, one way versus the other. But in general, you can do it explicitly by default. Things like regmod paths and the examples that I showed earlier, those are basically doing a substring match. So Carbon Black pretty intelligently tokenizes things like file paths and command line arguments, so that you can put in essentially a substring of varying length and just have that matched.
All right, I've got a couple more here. Does the desktop client support all operating systems? Everything I showed with the Carbon Black products are Windows, Mac, and Linux. Is there a risk of a system crash if Carbon Black blocked PowerShell or command run by the system? I haven't tried to do it yet to see if it would crash the system. It is a bit concerning, and that's where what we would want to do is look at, this is where the profiling of your network becomes so important. If you have that type of activity going on where the system is executing those processes, we need to learn about it first, and then look to architect the searches that are used to drive the automated response appropriately. And if you were concerned about it ahead of time or at all, certainly we could add into that search user identity, because user identity, the credentials used to spawn the processes, are recorded as well. So we can certainly test for that. And if you didn't want to take action against the system doing it, you could do so, but then you might also miss an attacker who had gamed the system. So there's a little bit of interplay there, but we always want you to be able to choose your own prevention and choose the right prevention for your risks. So certainly all those criteria are there to let you turn that knob exactly how you want it. There were a couple questions that asked if the machine was moved automatically based on the detection, and that is exactly what happened. I have a script running in the background of my enterprise response server that actually calls in and has the capability to modify the config inside of CB Enterprise Protection. That was exactly the move there. Is an event rule being used to move the end user policy? No, it is not. It is an actual Python script watching messages as they are received by Carbon Black Enterprise Response. Let's see. I have a scenario where I used PowerShell Empire to execute a payload, and it got my enterprise protection, it looks like, and you're having a hard time tracking it. That's the type of thing. We should be able to pick up some of that information. I'd need to see the data personally to really dig into it more and see what we could find. And this is why we starting to get into monitoring what are good and bad invocations of these tools and take action against them to lock them down. Because typically, yes, we're going to trust tools. So an enterprise protection without any extra information from enterprise response will let the tools execute.
I've got one here that's related to that. So there's a question related to, or a scenario essentially where, something like Empire is used to execute a payload, but for whatever reason, they didn't have a script in place or didn't have a query in place to identify that or block it. And so it looks like this was more of an analysis question, but can you detect that or can you pick that up? And so the short answer is yes, right? And this is much more operational. A huge part of what we do on the operation side is kind of taking this approach to looking at all processes, right? Whether it's a traditional P or whether it's a native tool being being leveraged in one of a number of ways. But looking at as much of that as we possibly can, and then taking from that specific features, treating them all as bad essentially until we can prove that they're good. I mentioned earlier that some of the things that we've detected and sent on to customers, they do end up being false positives, right? They might be very creative administrative use. As John mentioned earlier, the first time that I started to see the crush of PowerShell data as an analyst, I did the same thing. I kind of threw up my hands and said, encoded command, this is awful. And so you kind of default to assuming these things are terrible, which is probably the right approach. And so, a huge part of what we have to do, particularly looking across many, many environments at once, because they're certainly not uniform, is to really, again, start to score those features. As you start to see things like Empire and tools built on top of it, or any of those submodules, start to profile those. You definitely need to look well beyond just the PowerShell commands themselves, right? So yes, it's great to figure out to find these queries like some of the ones we showed you and the one that John used as an example, right? That'll cherry pick out PowerShell based strictly on PowerShell features and say this thing is bad and I want to take action. But look at where it came from, right? Look at who its parents are. So some of those obvious examples, browsers, mail clients, things that touch the internet or things that get sent to you, right? Take all of those. If PowerShell derives from those, you need to look at it. Same thing, right? You could take, all of your recon processes or even all of your, command line administrative utilities. If PowerShell is the parent of those, worth looking at, right? If PowerShell spawns the net command, right? So if you have a net command or net one and its parent is PowerShell, that's something that you absolutely want to take a look at. And so that's, at performing analysis, either against one enterprise or as a provider across many, you really, really want to take the approach that you assume it's bad until you can prove it's good, and then you got to learn from every decision that you make.
I got a couple more in here. Let's see. There was a question: is the block file name or hash based? And all of those actions that were taken were hash based when actions were taken against actual execution. There is a question about what looks like output from a Carbon Black Enterprise response about a specific invocation of PowerShell that includes all of the fun command line switches Mark showed: no pry file, non-interactive input format, an execution policy bypass. Just a glance at this, based on the file names in play, it doesn't immediately look malicious, but I would want to know if I had a DVD application package that needed to be updating somehow, because it's kind of what it looks like it was doing if it was benign. Might want to check the parent process there and see what spawned that. Maybe follow that one back a little to make sure it didn't spawn any other processes that look strange. My guess is it is probably an update and probably legitimate software. The question was also asked related to that, since the execution policy bypass appeared in that person's command. Would signed scripts have stopped or limited this? With that execution policy bypass, probably not. The controls inside of the system to force you to use signed scripts by having that command line switch that lets you just bypass that, It doesn't provide a great defense against that. Getting around those controls are not tough.
Okay, great. So if we have no more further questions, I think we can wrap this up. I just want to say thanks to Jonathan and Keith. It's been fantastic, great presentation. And the audience, fantastic questions coming in over the chat. So thank you very much for that. It's great to have those questions. It keeps it interactive. So everybody enjoy the rest of your day, and we'll see you soon. Thank you.